Welcome. In this explainer, we are digging into a really powerful idea from sociologist Gurminder K. Bhambra's work, Connected Sociologies. It's an idea that, honestly, asks us to question the very foundation of how we've been taught to understand society and the modern world.
So let's just start with a question that gets right to the heart of everything. What if the entire origin story that sociology tells about itself is just plain wrong?
Okay, so the core argument we're going to explore today is this. Sociology as a discipline has been built on a story that's all about Europe. It's neglected the fact that the world has always been globally connected. And this suggests that our whole understanding of modernity is based on a story that's, well, incomplete at best and pretty flawed at worst. So, let's dive in by unpacking that traditional story.
To really get what Bhambra's arguing, we first have to understand the story that sociology usually tells about itself, and especially its relationship with this huge concept we call modernity.
So the standard narrative kind of goes like this. Sociology and modernity basically created each other. They're co-constitutive. And modernity itself is seen as this totally unique European thing, sparked by the big hits, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, and so on. But here's the problem. This very specific, very European story gets presented as if it's the story of the entire world. And for a long time, as Bhambra points out, if you wanted to critique this idea, you pretty much had to do it from outside of sociology itself.
Bhambra argues this whole standard view is built on a really fundamental misunderstanding of history, a myth she calls separatist histories.
This right here gets to the absolute core of the argument. You see, the standard view imagines these separate, self-contained civilizations that only just recently started bumping into each other through globalization. Bhambra's critique completely flips that on its head. She argues that the thing we call modernity is actually the direct result of deep, long-standing connections that were defined by colonialism and dispossession. So the key takeaway isn't that separate societies eventually met. It's that their violent, deeply unequal connections are what created the modern world to begin with.
And this brings us to a really crucial point about the words we use. The standard narrative has a way of smoothing over the brutal reality of these connections. By framing something like colonialism or enslavement as just interaction or the spread of ideas. The violence, the theft, the appropriation at the heart of it all gets erased from our sociological theories.
This quote from sociologist John Goldthorpe just illustrates the critique so perfectly. He pointed out this tendency for historical sociology to be super selective. And Bhambra really builds on this, noting that while sociologists could have picked any histories, they almost always pick the ones that confirmed the standard Eurocentric narratives of superiority.
Okay, so if the foundation is flawed, how do we even start to rebuild it? This is exactly where post-colonial and decolonial thought come in and why they're so essential. These critical perspectives are absolutely central to Bhambra's whole argument. What they're saying is that you can't just separate the history of colonialism from the history of modernity or from the social sciences. They argue that things like dispossession and appropriation aren't just footnotes in the story. They are fundamental to how our world is set up and even to how we think we know things about it. So you can really think about it as this three-step process. First, our interconnected global world is created, it's forged, through the hard realities of empire. Then, step two, that whole messy, violent history of connection gets erased or neatly separated from the clean, triumphant story of modernity. And so the job for a connected sociology is step three, to make those hidden foundational connections visible all over again.
This brings us to what Bhambra actually proposes we do about it. And it's not just about, adding a few new facts to the pile. It's about a total reconstruction of the discipline's core methods.
To get the solution, we have to talk methodology for a second. So traditional sociology often uses what are called ideal types. Think of them like pure models to compare different societies. The problem, as Bhambra points out, is that when we find a society that doesn't fit the European model, we just tend to create a new box for it, like multiple modernities. But see how that leaves the original European model as the untouched, unquestioned default? Connected Sociology says, no, that's not enough. Instead of just adding more boxes, we need to use this new evidence to smash the original box and rebuild our concepts from the ground up. And this is just so important. It's about way more than just being inclusive for the sake of it. The real question is why this information was ignored in the first place. As Bhambra argues, this data wasn't just lost, it was actively excluded because it was tied to people and experiences that weren't seen as important. So bringing it back into the picture forces us to ask if our existing stories are even adequate anymore.
It's about creating a more accurate map of our shared world. Okay, so what does this actually look like in practice? Let's take a look at the super contemporary and often heated example of citizenship and migration. It really shows how this connected approach changes everything.
Now, here is a simple historical fact that is an absolute game changer when you really stop to think about it. For centuries, the political community for many European states wasn't just the nation, it was the empire. It was vastly bigger and more complex than the borders we see on a map today. And that completely changes how we should be thinking about national identity and who belongs.
I mean, just look at Britain. In 1707, you have the legal creation of the British nation-state. Then, just 50 years later, the Battle of Plassey massively expands its imperial power in India. These were not two separate storylines happening on parallel tracks. No, they were happening at the same time, shaping and feeding into each other. You simply cannot tell the story of the British nation without also telling the story of the British Empire. They are two sides of the very same coin.
And this isn't just some dusty old history, right? It has profound political consequences today. When we ignore these shared imperial histories, people who were once subjects or citizens of that bigger community show up in, say, London, and are suddenly mislabeled as migrants or newcomers. This whole framing completely erases a shared past and totally skews our modern debates on immigration and belonging.
Bhambra concludes her argument with this incredibly powerful call from Frantz Fanon. And it's important to see this isn't a call for destruction. It's a call for a collective, a comradely effort to create new, more honest ways of understanding the world we all share. It's an invitation to reconstruct meaning, together.
So really, the promise of a connected sociology isn't about tearing things down just for the sake of it. It's about finding a more honest, a more adequate story of our shared past. And in doing that, it gives us much better tools to ask better questions and hopefully to build a different, more just future. The questions here are a great place to start. What other forgotten connections can you see shaping the world we live in today? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.